Um, our next speaker is Bayes Ahmed, and so his background includes research in the field of disaster risk reduction, conflict and migration, and also climate change adaptation and community vulnerability assessment. He works at the intersection of conflict and disaster with a vision to help improve the living standards of forced migrants and stateless populations. He obtained his PhD in disaster risk reduction from the UCL, the University College London, and also has a master's degree in geospatial technologies from Spain, Germany, and Portugal, and a bachelor's in urban and regional planning from Bangladesh University of Engineering and Technology. And I think I mentioned at the beginning, he's with the Institute of Risk and Disaster Reduction at the University College London. So welcome, Bayes. I hope I am pronouncing your name. I think I might not be, but anyway, I tried.
Yes, thank you, Anna. Can you hear me properly?
Yes.
And can you see my slide?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so then let me start my talk. Yes, thank you, the Global Flood Partnership, for inviting me for the talk. So today I will give a presentation on a specific case study from Bangladesh, and I'm Dr. Bayes Ahmed. I work at University College London as a lecturer, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Yes, before I start, I want to give statistics. You all know in the last 20 years, the number of disaster events has increased compared to the previous 20 years, like between 1980 and 2000, around 4,000 disasters were reported, but since 2000, we have around double number of disasters reported. So the number of disasters are increasing. Many link it with climate change. And among all the disasters in the both rows, you can see between comparison between 2 decades in between 1980, 1999, and 2020. 19, the most prominent disaster was related to flooding. That's around 3,200. And the second prominent was storm, and that was 2000 in the last 20 years. So more than 60% disasters, or even 65, are linked to flooding and storm disasters in the last 20 years. And we have earthquakes, number 3, 8%. That's most deadly disaster, but the impact of flooding and storm also brings flooding, like in coastal areas. The impact is really disproportionate in different income level countries. Like we can expect around 284 deaths per disaster in low income countries. That number is really low for high income countries, that is 67 only. So disasters bring, particularly flooding and storm related disasters, extensive impact and damage in low income and low middle income countries. So today I will talk about Bangladesh, a country from South Asia, very well known for flooding worldwide. You can see from the map, we are surrounded by India on 3 sides and sharing border with Myanmar on the southwest, southeast. And from the map, you can see mostly it's flatland country. Yellow is, the elevation is really low, close to 0. Just on an average, you can see on the southern coast, and also a vast majority of our country is low-lying land, just above 1 or 2 meters from the mean sea level. Also, we have the world's largest river network in this country, and we have more than 700 major rivers. Some of them are very well known, the Brahmaputra and Jamuna, Ganges and Padma, and other rivers. So crisscrossed by rivers, and as a consequence, because the low elevation, flooding is really very common in Bangladesh. This is yearly phenomena, and also some years we experience massive flooding. We experience hilly flash flooding, riverine flooding, and in the coast, of course, that is coastal flooding or tidal waves or tidal surge is very prominent. And also we experience river erosion. Some scientists are connecting the, you remember in the last 20 years, we are experiencing more flooding events. That's just double compared to the decades in 1980s. And the most recent flooding in July this year, it affected around 38 million people and displaced hundreds and thousands of people, and they lost their houses and livelihood. Some scientists have found this year's event, it is, we should expect this kind of event once in 20-year time, but we are now experiencing it every 3 or 4 years. And that is linked to anthropogenic climate change. So here's the flood map from July 2020. The red areas were flooded. Almost 1/4 of the country was flooded, mostly on the northeast central part of the country and also on the southern coast. Here are some photographs taken by our partners. This is how it looks. The communities are underwater. The last photo was taken this month. Still, some areas are underwater. What are the impacts? First, pure drinking water. We really need to travel longer distances to collect pure water and store them on pots. And these are some typical images captured by our partners. This, you can see how it destroyed agricultural livelihood. Houses are damaged, and you can see children are swimming around their houses. So today I will talk about coastal flooding, mainly how it impacts the coastal community and its consequences, taking a case study from a central southern coastal district, namely Patuakhali. We have been monitoring this community since 2015. So they are named as Noapara and Pashurvania, highly vulnerable to cyclone and coastal flooding because the communities are just located above between 0 to 30 centimeters, not meter, above the mean sea level. Yes, there are early warning systems, but you remember the communities are protected by embankments or polders, and mostly these are tidal waves or flooding, and very difficult to predict and send early warnings. It's not, sometimes yes, the cyclone brings extensive flooding. The community has the map on the left. The yellow boundary is just sharing the border with the river named Golachipa, that is 5-kilometer width. And here are some photographs from the community taken by me during a fieldwork back in 2016. You can see the communities are protected by embankments on the top. Some households just near the river, and you can also see the Golachipa River in C and D. Just after a typical storm or tidal wave, it is very common because these are earthen embankments and they get destroyed, and the entire village is flooded. Also, it floods the agricultural land. Number C is the most safest house in the community. I took the photo, but just after a minor flooding, you see the house is almost underwater. And think about other houses or other community areas after a minor flooding. IFRC has defined community resilience as the community's ability to prepare for, cope with, and recover from this kind of flooding disasters without compromising their long-term prospect. Mainly, a community should have 6 characteristics. They should have access to different type of infrastructure and services. They should have both primary and secondary economic opportunities. They should be organized. They should know how to manage their natural resources like the rivers and the farmland. They should be knowledgeable and healthy and connected with all the components. So this is the framework we applied in the community. We wanted to understand whether the communities are resilient to flooding. So on 3 major things, we focused on livelihood, WASH, and DRR. And a number of activities were promoted by different partners and the government of Bangladesh and donors, like providing cash for work, cash for starting some secondary business related to grocery, poultry, rearing cattle, and yes, providing safety equipments and training. So we applied the typical household questionnaire and the focus group discussions type of survey method, and some highlights from the findings back in 2016. You see, they are trying to help themselves through different secondary sources of income, because the primary source for the men there is young men, is fish. I mean, they're fishermen and farmers mostly, but others like the women and elderly are involved in the first photograph, gardening, also grocery, showing machines, and rearing cattle. They also have now new raised tube wells in the top left, raised toilets in the top right, and new road networks to for better communication. And also number D is the government provided cyclone shelter. So combining everything, we compared, I mean, before and after the project intervention, and we found all of the communities, like around 90% of them face disasters on a regular basis, like flooding and cyclone. But the number of school-going children has increased by 55%. Now they get early warnings, really good early warning systems. So their secondary source of income or earning sources has increased dramatically by 60%. And also they have now raised toilets or sanitary latrine around 88%. That was back in 2013, only 42%. Some improvements are there in terms of those 6 components of resilience, and we compared like how it is, you know, adding some benefits for the community in terms of all these different variables. In the first column, like whether their monthly income has increased, we found in 3 years time it was increased. Also in many other, just to mention a few, whether they have any problem with drinking water, no. Whether sanitary latrines are available, yes. I mean, we compared how they're performing on different resilience components, like whether they're knowledgeable on DRR, they have internal or improved road network, yes. I mean, many things has or have improved, and we found they're more or less resilient to cyclone and flooding. But in this year, in May 2020, you all probably know about it, the cyclone Amphan, that the pathway was from India, that really impacted the coastal communities severely this year. 26 deaths were reported and millions of people were affected and houses were destroyed, as well as water points, bridges, roads, and livelihood. So what's the impact? Yes, we have done really well compared to 1970 cyclone that killed around 500,000 people in the coastal Bangladesh. The number of deaths was only 26 compared to that year in 1950. Also in other major cyclones, if you remember the 1991 cyclone killed over 100,000 people, but our death rate has really reduced because compared to 1970, we have, that time we only had around 40 cyclone shelters, but now we have 12,000 cyclone shelters and we also have strong early warning systems that can evacuate people on time and save lives. So it took us around 50 years to make sure the communities are resilient. The death rate has significantly reduced from cyclone and all these types of flooding because of different type of structural and non-structural resilience interventions. But yes, still few things it cannot avoid. These are photos from this year in extensive, like near around 500,000 houses were destroyed. That's around 2 or 3 million people were impacted. Some photos from the field, you can see the embankment was destroyed. On the right hand, the river, on the left is the community. There is a photo, the tube oil, it is underwater, even erased it. And after massive cyclone and flooding, coastal flooding. And this is the communities right now. And this photograph was taken just 2 weeks ago, but the cyclone and the tidal waves, the flooding is still there after 6 months. That is really impacting the agricultural activities and livelihood interventions in the community. Remember, even after 6 months, they have this amount of flood water in many of the coastal areas. So it has really extensive impact. We found just only 8% of our country is less hazard prone. We have flooding, different types, and also drought in southwest and river erosion. We found a strong correlation between poverty and the intensity of natural hazards. These communities and districts are really, they're the most poor communities in Bangladesh. So there is because it destroys the livelihood, houses, the communities are inundated for between 2 to 6 months, and it takes time to repair again, but you face after 2-3 years again a massive disaster or flooding or cyclone like this. It impacts around 1 or 2% of our GDP. So it is really important to understand the local context, the culture and organizational setup. I would really talk about last 15 or 20 years. One thing is really prominent in Bangladesh that was never before reported in massive scale, like disaster displacement is now very common. From these communities, around 15 to 20% people, they migrate. They are forced to migrate because the disasters, the floodwater for 6 months or more there destroys livelihood, and that causes poverty. Already these communities are fragile, and we try to provide lots of support through our resilience projects, but everything has some limits because you can see the vastness and extensive impact of those hazards. So we found overall in Bangladesh around 7% people migrate because of this kind of environmental disasters, and 4% of them are found as climate migrants. The World Bank has projected there will be around 13 million displaced climate migrants in Bangladesh by 2015. As of today, we have something between 2 to 4 million. Many of them, those environmental migrants, convert into economic migrants, and disaster displacement is a new phenomenon despite having all those different projects, and that is really causing a massive problem for Bangladesh as well as for international communities. Yes, those people try to migrate, mostly young men, for a better living standard. This is highly debated. Are they mostly internally displaced or some of them cross borders? And this is the findings from our recent work, not yet published, but you can see in Bangladesh, only 9% people migrate internally. Among them, 64% migrate solely related to economic, and among the economic migrants, 72% migrate because of environmental related disasters, and they're mostly coming from river flooding and coastal flooding types of areas. Displacement has been reported by the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, IDMC. Last year in 2019, Bangladesh was among the top 5 disaster-related displaced country. In 2019, around 4 million people were displaced because of climatic disasters. 2020, it would be around 7 to 8 million people. And this is not only Bangladesh. Globally, last year, 33 million people were displaced. Among them, 8.5 million were related to conflict and violence, but extensively people were displaced, that is around 25 million because of disasters, and among them 24 million people globally were displaced because of weather or climate related events, and flooding was 10 million. The first was 12 million by cyclone, because cyclone also brings flooding, the coastal flooding. So disaster displacement is not a problem for Bangladesh right now, it's a global problem. And is it creating any humanitarian crisis? Because you all know thousands of people are illegally trying to cross the Mediterranean Sea and trying to enter Europe and other developed countries. Here is a news from August last month, how children and women and others are taking risks of their lives. But interestingly, this year, from the number of people who arrived in Europe between January and August, you see here the numbers, and Bangladesh is interestingly in number 6. I can understand from Afghanistan, 3,000, Syria, more or less 2,800, but why Bangladesh is there? We are not at war, or there is no massive conflict. It needs to be really investigated. And mostly they are young men who face poverty. Again, poverty is linked to disasters. And joblessness, yes, there's, because after so much flooding, how do you get jobs? And Libya and Tunisia are the main port of entry. And this year, this is out of many news, one just highlighting here, 24 Bangladeshis were killed by the smugglers in Libya who were trying to cross borders. So it is time to think about how flooding impacts community, their livelihood, and also their way of living. 10 to 20% people are being displaced from those areas, and it creates poverty at the end. That is the first thing to address by the Sustainable Development Goal. And is it linked to this kind of cross-border relationship? So it is really important to think about how the resilience intervention works from the individual, that's the bottom of this diagram, you'll see, to household, community, but we should not stop here at community scale. Think about how it can be connected with national, regional, and global interventions for building resilience on flooding and climatic disasters. So a global network of helping each other and working in collaboration is really required. So that's all from me. Thank you, and you can email me anytime here. Yes, thanks for giving me the scope to present.
Thank you very much.